July 1943, during Operation Husky, Allied forces invaded Sicily, capturing more than 130,000 Axis soldiers. Thousands of Italian prisoners were transferred to camps in the United States, where the American War Department implemented treatment policies that sharply contrasted with the expectations shaped by fascist propaganda. Captain Enrico Bellini never imagined that defeat could taste like homemade tomato sauce. When the gates of the POW camp closed behind him that August afternoon in 1943, his hands trembled not from fear of death, but from the certainty that he would find only American cruelty. Yet the scent drifting from the kitchens carried something impossible: fresh oregano, golden garlic, and the unmistakable aroma of pasta boiling. This is the story of Italian POWs couldn't believe they were served pasta and wine in U.S. camps, a tale of how a simple dinner shattered years of fascist propaganda. The war had ended for these men, but their greatest battle was only beginning. The train screeched to a metallic halt that echoed through the Kansas valleys, like the lament of rusted iron. Captain Enrico Bellini pressed his face against the bars of the window, staring at the golden vastness stretching as far as the eye could see. His eyes, accustomed to Sicily's rocky hills, struggled to take in the immensity of those cornfields, rippling like a land-bound sea beneath the August sun. Sweat trickled down his forehead, mixing with the dust from the 3-day journey from New York, leaving salty tracks on his sunburned skin. He had commanded an artillery battery in Catania and had watched men die at his feet, but he had never felt a loneliness as profound as in that moment, surrounded by hundreds of fellow countrymen equally adrift. America was larger than any map could suggest, and he was nothing more than a grain of sand in this desert of unknown possibilities. Luigi Conti, just 19 and with hands still too soft for war, clutched his small cardboard suitcase as if it held all the world's secrets. Inside lay only a faded photograph of his mother in the farmhouse kitchen in Abruzzo, a broken rosary, and an unsent letter to Maria, the girl who had promised to wait for his return. The clank of uncoupling rail cars sounded like funeral bells in his young ears, each metallic beat marking the end of a life he had barely begun to know. His boots, worn through from the long march across Sicilian territory, touched American soil for the first time with involuntary reverence, as though stepping onto sacred ground. He did not know whether to pray for the nightmare to end quickly, or for the courage to face it with the dignity his mother had tried to teach him through long winter nights at home. Sergeant Robert Miller watched the prisoners disembark with a complex mix of professional curiosity and personal melancholy. His grandparents had left Naples with dreams similar to those he now saw reflected in the frightened eyes of the young soldiers, but they had arrived as hopeful immigrants, not as defeated prisoners. The irony did not escape him. He was there to guard men who spoke the same language his nonna had whispered in her nightly prayers, men who likely knew the same lullabies that still echoed in his childhood memory. The American uniform on his shoulders felt as heavy as an ancestral responsibility, each star and insignia reminding him that he represented not only his country, but also the hope that the war might end with dignity for everyone involved. He had seen liberated concentration camps in Europe, and knew that the treatment of prisoners could reflect the soul of a nation. He was determined to ensure that America revealed its noblest face. The air carried strange aromas that confused the newcomers' senses, a blend of fertile soil, industrial machinery, and something surprisingly familiar they could not immediately identify. Father Thomas O'Leary moved among the groups of prisoners with the serenity of a man who had found his divine purpose in times of chaos, his calloused hands offering silent blessings as he gazed at faces burdened with lost battles and broken dreams. He had served in field hospitals in France and knew the universal language of human suffering. In these men he recognized not enemies, but lost sons of God who needed to find hope again. His murmured Latin prayers sounded like celestial music to ears accustomed to Italian dialects, building invisible bridges between cultures the war had tried to separate forever. The cross on his chest gleamed under the American sun, reflecting a light that promised redemption, even in the darkest moments of human history. The first meal would be served in 2 hours, But already the unmistakable aroma of food drifted from the camp kitchens, scents that awakened involuntary memories of family Sundays and harvest festivals in small Italian towns. The prisoners walked in an orderly line, their steps creating a symphony of worn soles on American soil, each footprint marking not only their physical arrival, but also the beginning of an emotional journey none of them could yet imagine. Bellini noticed a few American guards giving discreet waves, gestures that violently contradicted the tales of brutality fascist propaganda had hammered into their minds during months of military indoctrination. There was something different about this place, something that defied everything they had been taught about the American enemy. This discovery was at once comforting and profoundly unsettling. The war had taught them to hate, but reality was beginning to teach them something entirely different. The gate closed behind them with a final sound that echoed like the end of one chapter and the start of another. And Bellini realized that his true battle would not be against American guards, but against his own convictions. The mess hall stretched before them like a secular cathedral, with long tables of pale wood, gleaming beneath electric lamps, creating an atmosphere more like a university cafeteria than a military prison. Bellini hesitated at the entrance, his soldiers' eyes automatically cataloging emergency exits and defensive positions. But his dormant civilian mind began to awaken at the unexpected sight of paper napkins folded beside each plate, as if they were guests at a formal dinner. The low murmur of English conversations mingled with the metallic clink of utensils being set, creating a domestic symphony that violently contrasted with the tense silence he had expected in a POW camp. His hands, still trembling from the journey, clutched his tattered uniform, an anchor of identity in a sea of experiences that defied everything he thought he knew about war and enmity. The nearest table displayed a red and white checkered cloth that could have come straight from a trattoria in Rome, and he wondered if he was dreaming, or had stepped through some dimensional portal that had transformed his prison into an Italian restaurant. Luigi followed Bellini with hesitant steps, his youthful fingers nervously playing with the broken rosary in his pocket. Each smooth beat a whispered prayer that his mother would never learn where he was or what he had become. The scent wafting from the kitchens was impossible to ignore. Fresh basil, ripe tomatoes slowly simmering, and something his farm boy's nose recognized immediately: authentic Parmesan being freshly grated. He had grown up helping in the farmhouse kitchen, knew every aromatic nuance that turned simple ingredients into memorable meals. But he had never imagined encountering those same aromas on American soil, especially served to captured Italian soldiers. Tears came without warning, betraying the mask of toughness he had tried to build since his capture. Salty drops carrying homesickness, fear of the future, and a confused gratitude he could not fully understand. The rough texture of the American work uniform he wore contrasted with the unexpected softness of that environment, creating a sensory dissonance that left him dizzy with possibilities. Sergeant Miller watched the prisoners enter with a discreet smile he tried to hide, but which betrayed his satisfaction at seeing the positive shock etched on the faces of men who had expected punishment and found hospitality instead. He had personally worked with the head cook to ensure that the first meal would be a silent statement of American values, not through words or propaganda, but through the universal language of good food shared with dignity. The tables had been set as if for honored guests, with clean plates, real glassware instead of metal mugs, and even small vases of wildflowers picked by American guards that very morning. Every detail was designed to communicate respect for these men's humanity, regardless of their former political affiliations, because Miller deeply believed that America's true strength lay in its ability to turn enemies into friends through the practical demonstration of its values. He noticed how some prisoners discreetly touched the tablecloths, testing the fabric's texture, as if to confirm that this was not some cruel illusion meant to break their psychological resistance. Father O'Leary moved among the tables with the natural grace of one who had spent decades offering comfort in times of crisis, his calloused hands distributing genuine smiles and gentle words in Italian learned during his studies in the Vatican before the war. He understood that this meal was not merely about physical nourishment, but about spiritual healing, about proving that even in times of conflict, Shared humanity could prevail over the artificial divisions created by political ideologies. His silent prayers included both prisoners and guards, recognizing that all were children of God who needed to find hope and purpose in extraordinary circumstances that no military manual could have adequately prepared them for. The crucifix around his neck caught the lamplight, casting tiny rainbows that danced across the tables like luminous blessings, and he interpreted this as a divine sign of approval for his mission to build bridges between cultures through practical compassion. Each conversation he began was carefully calibrated to offer comfort without condescension, understanding without judgment, and hope without false promises about the uncertain future that awaited them all. The first course arrived, carried by American soldiers serving with a professional courtesy, bordering on reverence, as if recognizing the symbolic importance of this moment for men who had lost everything except their human dignity. Steaming spaghetti al pomodoro, prepared by Italian-American cooks who insisted on using only the highest quality ingredients available, even amid the rationing. Restrictions affecting American civilians across the country because they understood that this meal represented something greater than simple sustenance. The sauce had been made with tomatoes grown by Italian farmers settled in Kansas for 3 generations, men who had voluntarily offered their best produce when they learned it would be served to captured compatriots, turning a simple act of feeding into an ethnic solidarity that transcended national borders. Fresh bread, still warm from the ovens, accompanied each portion, its golden crust releasing aromatic steam when broken, revealing a soft white interior that melted in the mouth like a promise of abundance in a time of global scarcity. The initial silence gave way to murmurs of disbelief, then to sighs of satisfaction, and finally to quiet conversations in Italian that echoed through the mess hall like a symphony of gratitude and confusion. Bellini lifted the first forkful to his mouth with the solemnity of a man participating in a sacred ritual, and when the familiar flavor exploded on his palate, he closed his eyes and for the first time in months, allowed himself to remember his mother without feeling only pain. The second week in the camp brought a routine that defied every expectation Bellini had carried about life in captivity, turning days that should have been marked by humiliation and deprivation into experiences that resembled a militarized summer retreat more than a prisoner of war camp. Mornings began with real coffee, not the bitter chicory they had drunk during the final months of war in Italy, but freshly roasted Brazilian beans that filled the mess hall, with an aroma that awakened memories of Neapolitan cafes and early morning conversations with senior officers in simpler times. He had established a habit of walking along the inner perimeter of the camp, observing the American vastness stretching beyond the fences, no longer as a prison keeping him away from home, but as a reminder of the generosity of a country with enough space and resources to treat its prisoners with a dignity he doubted Italy would offer captured American soldiers. The sound of laughter from the recreation areas began to unsettle him, not because of the joy itself, but because it forced him to confront his own emotional resistance to American hospitality and to face the possibility that everything he had learned about the enemy might be fundamentally wrong. Luigi had discovered that some of the American cooks were descendants of Italian immigrants who spoke the dialect of his home region with a fluency that brought him to tears of both longing and gratitude, men who had crossed the Atlantic under the same precarious conditions as his own ancestors, but who now returned that hospitality to compatriots in completely different circumstances. In the afternoons, he volunteered in the kitchens, his young hands relearning family recipes under the guidance of Tony Benedetto, a second-generation cook who insisted on teaching him American culinary techniques, adapted from Sicilian traditions that had evolved over decades of experimentation on foreign soil. The manual work offered him an involuntary therapy. Every chopped tomato, every crushed clove of garlic, every pot stirred in rhythm, worked like a meditation that calmed his young mind still traumatized by the violence he had witnessed during the war's final months in Europe. His once nervous hands found purpose and steadiness in the kitchen routine, and he began to imagine a future in which he could bring this knowledge back to his family in Abruzzo, transforming his American experience into something productive that would benefit his local community. The familiar texture of pasta between his fingers connected him at once to the past he had left behind, and to the unexpectedly welcoming present he was now experiencing. On the Thursday of the second week, Sergeant Miller announced there would be a special celebration to mark what he diplomatically called a successful cultural integration, a party that would include not only traditional Italian food, prepared by the prisoners themselves, but also live music and, more surprisingly, a limited ration of Californian red wine that had been specially approved by the higher command as a gesture of goodwill. The news spread through the camp like fire in dry straw, sparking excited conversations that mixed disbelief, gratitude, and a lingering suspicion that this might be an elaborate psychological trap meant to break their moral and political resistance. Miller had worked for weeks to gain that approval, arguing to his superiors that tangible demonstrations of respect for Italian culture would serve American interests in the long run far better than any formal program of political re-education, because men treated with dignity would return to Italy as unwitting ambassadors of American hospitality. He watched the prisoners' reactions with the quiet satisfaction of a diplomat who had staked his career on the belief that practical kindness could be more effective than brute force in transforming enemies into allies. Each genuine smile, each surprised expression of gratitude, each moment of lowered guard represented a small victory in the larger war for the soul of humanity in times of global conflict. Father O'Leary had organized a small choir made up of prisoners with musical experience, men who had sung in the churches of their hometowns or who simply possessed naturally harmonious voices capable of offering appropriate entertainment for the planned celebration. During the afternoon rehearsals, the sound of Italian voices singing traditional songs echoed through the camp as a melancholy reminder that even in prison, art and culture continued to flourish when given proper nourishment and genuine respect. He had carefully chosen a repertoire that included both religious hymns and secular folk melodies, avoiding any material that might be interpreted as political propaganda by either side, focusing instead on universal themes of love, family, hope, and faith that would resonate with both American guards and Italian prisoners. His private conversations with the participants revealed men who were beginning to process their situation emotionally, gradually moving from initial shock through denial and anger toward a complex acceptance that did not mean disloyalty to Italy, but rather a recognition that humanity could transcend temporary political divisions. The rosary in his hands offered tactile comfort during long nights, as he reflected on the theological meaning of finding God in the kindness of strangers, wondering if this experience might represent a small revelation of the divine nature, manifested through human hospitality. The morning of the celebration dawned clear and fresh, with a gentle breeze carrying the aroma of bread baking and sauces simmering slowly, creating an atmosphere reminiscent of harvest festivals in small Italian towns during peacetime, times that now seemed to belong to an entirely different life. Bellini awoke with a strange anxiety, a mix of positive anticipation and moral guilt that left him restless, as though he were betraying not only his country, but also his own identity, by allowing himself to feel genuine joy in American captivity. He put on his cleanest uniform, not out of vanity, but out of respect for the event, organizers, and for the compatriots who would share this unique experience, a gesture of personal dignity, representing his attempt to maintain moral integrity, even as his political convictions were being subtly challenged by the daily reality of respectful treatment. The cracked mirror in the communal bathroom reflected a man different from the one who had stepped off the train weeks earlier. Less angular, less defensive, with eyes that had begun to shine again with something like cautious hope. As his hands adjusted the uniform, they trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a complex emotion he could not adequately name, a mix of gratitude, confusion, and a reluctant recognition that his concepts of America and Americans were being fundamentally reshaped through direct experience. When the sun reached its zenith, the aroma of wine mingled with the scent of food, and Bellini knew that his personal war against prejudice was only just beginning. The wine arrived in dark green glass bottles that caught the late afternoon light like small beacons of civilization. each labeled with Californian names that sounded exotically American, yet carried winemaking traditions, transplanted from Italian regions some prisoners recognized from their own home provinces. Bellini held his glass with almost religious reverence, watching the deep ruby color dance beneath the lights of the mess hall, now transformed into a ballroom, each reflection reminding him of Tuscan vineyards he had visited before the war, when life still followed predictable seasonal rhythms and enemies were political abstractions, rather than human faces offering genuine hospitality. The first sip exploded on his palate with a complexity that defied his expectations of American wine, revealing layers of flavor that spoke of rich soil, careful craftsmanship, and traditions preserved through generations of immigrants who had carried their skills across the ocean like precious family treasures. His tears came without warning, drops that carried not only homesickness, but also a painful acknowledgement that he had misjudged an entire country based on propaganda that painted Americans as barbarians without culture or sophistication. The wine's velvety texture on his tongue contrasted with the roughness of his prison uniform, creating a sensory dissonance that symbolized the complexity of his situation, a free man in mind, a prisoner in circumstance, yet treated like an honored guest in a land that was supposed to be his enemy. Luigi found himself laughing for the first time since his capture, a genuine laugh that bubbled up from his chest like water from a long, dry spring sparked by the stories Tony Benedetto told about his Neapolitan grandparents and their early attempts to adapt traditional recipes to the ingredients available in early 20th century America. The wine had relaxed his emotional defenses, allowing the natural joy of his youth to emerge from the layers of trauma and fear that had built up through months of war, bombings, and uncertainty about his future. He watched American guards casually chatting with Italian prisoners, trading family stories, comparing worn photographs of wives and children, discovering that the universal feelings of love and longing transcended different uniforms and opposing flags. His young hands gestured animatedly as he tried to explain in basic English how his mother prepared ravioli at Christmas, using a mix of words, mime, and impromptu drawings on napkins that created a hybrid language of human communication that worked better than any military phrasebook. The sound of mingled laughter, American and Italian, filled the mess hall with a music he had never thought possible in a prisoner camp, a symphony of reconciliation that defied everything he had been taught about war, hatred, and irreconcilable cultural differences. Each sip of wine was a small celebration of life, an affirmation that even in the most unlikely circumstances, shared humanity could flourish when nourished with mutual respect and genuine hospitality. Sergeant Miller moved through the party with a discreet pride he tried to mask professionally, but which shone in his eyes every time he witnessed a positive interaction between guards and prisoners, each moment of genuine connection validating his bet that dignified treatment would yield better long-term results than intimidation or punishment. He had noticed how some of the older prisoners, men who had initially kept a wary distance, were now actively engaging in conversations, sharing family photos, and even offering paternal advice to young American soldiers who reminded them of sons left behind in Italy. His own memories of Sundays at his nonna's house took on new depth as he watched these men recreate family traditions on American soil, turning a prisoner camp into an improvised extension of the kitchens and dining rooms that had defined their ethnic childhoods. The wine had created an atmosphere of camaraderie he recognized from family gatherings, where political differences were temporarily suspended in favor of deeper human connections that resisted the artificial divisions imposed by international conflict. Every spontaneous laugh, every friendly toast, every moment of lowered guard represented a small victory in the larger war for the soul of Western civilization, proving that American values of hospitality and inclusion could transform enemies into friends through practical demonstration rather than empty rhetoric. He mentally drafted his report to superiors, knowing he would need to translate these qualitative observations into quantitative military language that justified continuing humanitarian policies even when resources were scarce and wartime pressures grew by the day. Father O'Leary watched the celebration with a deep spiritual satisfaction he interpreted as divine confirmation that his faith in the fundamental goodness of humanity had not been naive but prophetic, anticipating possibilities for reconciliation that others deemed impossible in times of global conflict. His silent prayers included gratitude for the chance to witness Christian love in action, manifested not through sermons or rituals, but through practical acts of hospitality that spoke more eloquently of gospel values than any homily he might have prepared. He moved among mixed groups of Americans and Italians, offering informal blessings in Latin that were understood and appreciated regardless of specific religious affiliation, because he recognized that the moment transcended particular denominations to touch something universal about human hope in the face of adversity. The improvised choir had evolved to include both guards and prisoners, American voices attempting familiar Italian melodies, while Italian voices tried American folk songs, creating hybrid harmonies that symbolize future possibilities for cultural cooperation that could outlast the war's eventual end. His conversations revealed men on both sides who were processing experiences that challenged prior prejudices, forcing them to reconsider not only opinions about the enemy, but also deeper questions about human nature, morality in wartime, and the possibilities of forgiveness and reconciliation that transcended temporary political divides. The crucifix on his chest caught reflections from the wine glasses, casting small rainbows he interpreted as symbols of divine hope, manifested through simple yet transformative human hospitality. As night fell over Kansas, the mess hall glowed with a golden light that turned the faces of guards and prisoners into gentle masks of contentment, each expression reflecting an inner peace that had been rare during months of war, fear, and uncertainty about the future. Bellini found himself toasting with a young American soldier from Ichim, Chicago, whose grandparents had emigrated from the same Italian province where he had grown up, a coincidence that led them to discover distant family connections and shared traditions that had survived across generations and oceans. Their conversations revealed that both had been raised with the same lullabies, the same family recipes, the same values of hospitality that now connected them across the artificial divisions created by war, proof that shared cultures endure longer than temporary political conflicts. The wine had dissolved language barriers, enabling communication through gestures, smiles, and a universal language of shared humanity that worked better than any formal translation could have achieved. He realized he was experiencing something no military manual had ever described: the possibility of remaining loyal to his homeland while developing genuine respect for the values and people of a nation that technically remained his official enemy. The texture of the moment, the smooth wine, the blended voices, the golden light, the aroma of food and fellowship created a memory he knew he would carry forever, regardless of what the future held for his status as a prisoner of war. When the last song was sung and the last glasses were emptied, Bellini understood that his personal war against prejudice had ended in a voluntary surrender that did not signify defeat, but the victory of humanity over propaganda. The permission to write home arrived in the third week like an unexpected gift that sent the entire camp into an emotional upheaval. Men who had maintained stoic composure through lost battles now trembling before blank sheets of paper that represented their first real chance to communicate with families who probably believed them dead or missing forever. Bellini held his pen as if it were a delicate weapon, weighing every word carefully before entrusting it to the page, knowing that his letter would be censored by both American and Italian authorities, and had to convey his situation without jeopardizing either his own safety or the reputation of his captors, who had shown an unexpected humanity. He began 10 times before finding the right words to describe his experience without sounding like American propaganda or Italian betrayal, a diplomatic task that challenged his skills as an officer trained for military command, but not for navigating emotional and political complexities that no war manual had ever addressed. The paper absorbed his involuntary tears as he tried to explain to his wife Elena that he was alive, well treated, and confused by feelings he could neither fully understand nor articulate in a letter that would be read by strangers before reaching her hands. His words danced between emotional honesty and political caution, each sentence a small masterpiece of personal diplomacy that sought to convey love, longing, complex gratitude, and a fundamental shift in his worldview that he himself was still trying to process. Luigi wrote to his mother with a desperate urgency that made his handwriting tremble like leaves in the wind, his words pouring out in emotional torrents that mixed the Abruzzo dialect with the formal Italian he had learned at school, creating a hybrid language of filial love that expressed both his youth and the forced maturity brought by experiences no son should ever have to explain to a worried mother. He wrote about the food, about the kind guards, about the English lessons some American soldiers voluntarily offered in the afternoons, but avoided mentioning the nightmares that still woke him some nights, or the persistent fear that all this kindness might be a cruel illusion that would vanish without warning. His descriptions of life in the camp were painted in gentle colors that downplayed the reality of imprisonment while emphasizing the elements of hospitality, because he wanted his mother to sleep better knowing that her son was being treated with dignity, even if that meant omitting details about surveillance, fences, and the constant reality that his freedom depended entirely on the goodwill of strangers. The coarse texture of the American paper contrasted with the perfumed letters his mother had once sent him before the war. But he pressed his words into the page with such love that he hoped she could feel his touch through the ink. Physical connection across impossible distances. Each paragraph was a small prayer, each sentence a silent promise that he would survive this experience and return home a better man, wiser, more grateful for the small kindnesses that make life worth living, even in the most improbable circumstances. Sergeant Miller oversaw the distribution of paper and envelopes with a professional satisfaction that masked his anxiety about how these letters might be interpreted by higher authorities who had not personally witnessed the positive transformation he observed daily in the prisoners' behavior and attitudes. He had argued vigorously with command for the right to allow family correspondence, not only for humanitarian reasons, but because he believed prisoners with high morale would cause fewer disciplinary problems and might eventually serve as ambassadors of American hospitality when they returned to Italy after the war's end. His own observations revealed men processing complex experiences that challenged propaganda on both sides, forcing them to develop more nuanced opinions about war, international politics, and human nature that could positively influence future relations between America and Italy. He moved among the tables where prisoners wrote with intense concentration, offering English-Italian dictionaries and even suggestions for phrasing that could help their messages pass censorship without losing essential emotional meaning. Each letter represented a small victory in the war for Italian public opinion, because he knew that families receiving positive reports of POW treatment would share that news with neighbors, creating an informal network of communication that could be far more effective than any official propaganda campaign. His own letters home included careful descriptions of his work that tried to convey professional pride without revealing operational details, because he wanted his family to understand that he was taking part in something significant, something that went beyond the simple guarding of prisoners and touched larger issues of cultural diplomacy and international human relations. Father O'Leary offered translation services and pastoral counseling to men struggling to express complex feelings in appropriate words, his decades of experience in the confessional giving him a special ability to help people articulate difficult emotions without judgment or pressure to conform to external expectations. He recognized that these letters represented more than simple family communication. They were historical documents capturing a unique moment in American military history, when Christian hospitality had triumphed over political hatred, creating possibilities for reconciliation that could influence international relations for generations. His conversations with prisoners seeking guidance revealed men wrestling with deep theological questions about forgiveness, loyalty, gratitude, and morality in wartime, questions that challenged the simple categories of right and wrong they had learned in childhood catechism classes in Italy. He offered biblical perspectives on hospitality toward strangers, reminding them that Christian tradition valued kindness toward enemies as one of the highest virtues, allowing them to process their feelings of gratitude without guilt over national or religious betrayal. His own prayers included pleas for wisdom to navigate the ethical complexities of his position as an American chaplain serving both guards and prisoners, recognizing that his ultimate loyalty was to God and to Christian principles that transcended temporary national affiliations. The rosary in his hands offered tactile comfort during long counseling sessions, as men wept openly over homesickness, fear of the future, and confusion about contradictory feelings they could not reconcile with their previous identities as loyal soldiers of the fascist regime. The censorship of the letters revealed a consistent narrative that surprised even the most skeptical American officers about humanitarian policies. Detailed descriptions of respectful treatment, abundant food, adequate medical care, and educational opportunities that stood in dramatic contrast to reports of American POWs in Axis camps that reached the United States through neutral diplomatic channels. Each letter cleared for mailing represented a propaganda victory that cost far less than radio campaigns or airdropped leaflets, but could have far greater impact because it came from trusted sources, sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers whose words carried emotional authority no official source could match. Miller compiled statistics on recurring themes in the letters as evidence for his superiors that investment in humane treatment was producing measurable dividends in prisoner morale, cooperation with camp authorities, and potential positive influence on Italian public opinion about the United States. He noticed how prisoners who had initially been the most resistant and suspicious were now writing some of the most enthusiastic letters about American hospitality, suggesting that time and consistent experience were more effective in changing attitudes than any formal program of political re-education. His own analysis identified specific language that reappeared in multiple letters, references to dignity, respect, unexpected kindness, and being treated as human beings, indicating that the American strategy was striking exactly the values it intended to convey. The emotional texture of the letters, genuine gratitude, positive surprise, recognition of shared humanity, created a portrait of success he hoped to present as a model for other military installations that still operated under more punitive philosophies of prisoner treatment. When the first replies began arriving 5 weeks later, the entire camp transformed into a quiet celebration of restored connections and renewed hopes, each envelope representing an emotional bridge across oceans and war zones, reconnecting hearts separated by extraordinary historical circumstances. December arrived in Kansas with a surprisingly gentle snowfall that turned the prisoner of war camp into a postcard landscape reminiscent of European winters, yet with an American vastness that still awed men accustomed to Italy's compact hills, creating an atmosphere of contemplative quiet that prepared hearts for reflections on meaning, memory, and future possibilities during one of the most significant seasons of the Christian calendar. Bellini watched snowflakes settle on the barbed wire fences, transforming prison barriers into crystalline, decorations that seemed to bless even symbols of confinement with unexpected beauty, a visual metaphor he interpreted as divine hope manifested through the transformation of negative elements into aesthetically redemptive experiences. Letters from home had brought news that Elena was pregnant with their first child, a baby who would be born while he remained in American captivity, an irony that mixed profound joy with the complex melancholy of long-distance fatherhood and the influence his child would receive in his absence. The Kansas cold penetrated the American-issued winter uniform he wore, warmer and better made than any clothing he had worn, during his final months of Italian military service, contrast that constantly reminded him that even the practical aspects of his imprisonment exceeded the conditions he had experienced. As a free soldier in his own army, he had begun to dream in English occasionally, a development that troubled him not because of the language itself, but for what it represented, an unconscious adaptation to a culture that was supposed to remain foreign, forcing him to question the boundaries between practical survival and cultural assimilation that might compromise his core Italian identity. Luigi had become Tony Benedetto's unofficial assistant in preparing an authentic Italian Christmas feast that would serve both prisoners and guards, a culinary collaboration that embodied cultural unity through the universal language of shared food during the most significant season of the Christian year. His young hands had learned pasta-making techniques even his own mother had never mastered, family secrets passed down through generations of Italian-American cooks who had preserved traditions while adapting them to American ingredients and tastes. He worked 16-hour days preparing dishes that required days of advance effort. Homemade pasta, drying on improvised racks, sauces simmering slowly in enormous pots, special breads requiring precise techniques he had once watched his nonna use during the holiday celebrations of his childhood in Abruzzo. The constant aroma of Italian cooking drifting from the mess halls created a home-like atmosphere that turned the entire camp into an extension of family traditions, allowing men far from home to find emotional comfort through olfactory memories that connected a difficult present to happier pasts. His letters home now included detailed recipes learned from American cooks' culinary gifts he intended to bring back to his family as tangible evidence that positive experiences could emerge even from circumstances that were initially traumatic. The familiar texture of pasta between his fingers offered a daily meditation that calmed anxieties about an uncertain future, each repetitive motion of his hands functioning like a silent prayer for protection, wisdom, and the opportunity to repay the hospitality he had unexpectedly received in a foreign land. Sergeant Miller had organized a Christmas celebration that would include both American and Italian traditions, a cultural fusion that embodied his personal belief that mutual respect produced better outcomes than unilateral cultural dominance, even in a military context where hierarchy was necessary for order and security. He had spent weeks coordinating with local suppliers to secure special ingredients for authentically Italian dishes, arguing to his superiors that the extra costs would be justified by morale benefits that would reduce disciplinary problems and demonstrate American values through practical action rather than empty rhetoric. His observations of changing prisoner behavior provided empirical evidence that humanitarian policies were producing measurable results. A significant reduction in escape attempts, increased voluntary cooperation with camp rules, and the development of positive relationships between guards and prisoners that eased daily operations for everyone involved. He had invited the families of civilian staff to participate in the celebration, a decision reflecting his conviction that normalizing relations between Americans and Italians should include women and children, who could demonstrate a family-centered hospitality that transcended purely military contexts. His own childhood memories of Christmases in Chicago, where his nonna's Italian traditions mingled with the customs of Irish and Polish neighbors, offered him a personal model of cultural integration that respected differences while celebrating shared humanity. The Christmas tree in the main mess hall had been decorated with ornaments handmade by the prisoners themselves, improvised crafts that combined available American materials with Italian decorative techniques, creating a hybrid aesthetic symbolizing future possibilities for post-war cultural cooperation. Father O'Leary had prepared a bilingual Christmas Mass that would include both Italian and American hymns, a liturgy recognizing that worship of God transcends national borders and that the Christian faith provides common ground for mutual understanding, even among people who had been official enemies in temporary political conflicts. His homilies emphasized themes of forgiveness, reconciliation, and hope, speaking directly to the prisoners' experiences without minimizing the hardships of their situation or the moral complexities of war, while offering spiritual perspectives to help them find meaning and purpose, even in circumstances they had not chosen. He had organized a choral presentation that would feature both guards and prisoners singing together songs celebrating the birth of Christ as a universal symbol of divine hope expressed through human vulnerability, a message that resonated deeply with men who had experienced their own vulnerabilities through capture and dependence on the kindness of strangers. His pastoral conversations revealed prisoners processing profound spiritual experiences that challenged their earlier understandings of divine providence. personal purpose, and the ways God might work through seemingly negative circumstances to produce spiritual growth and insights into human nature. His own prayers included gratitude for the opportunity to witness Christian love in action through practical hospitality that spoke more eloquently of gospel values than theoretical sermons, confirming his belief that authentic faith is manifested through concrete acts of compassion for the needy and vulnerable. The nativity scene he had built with the help of prisoners featured figures carved in wood by Italian craftsmen using tools provided by American carpenters, a collaborative work of art that created a unique creche, blending the aesthetic traditions of both cultures in a representation of the sacred story that belonged to all humanity. Christmas night transformed the mess hall into an improvised cathedral, where soft lights created an atmosphere of reverence that allowed both celebration and contemplation. Each candle representing a silent prayer for distant families, for future peace, and for gratitude for the unexpected kindness that had turned captivity into an experience of personal and spiritual growth. Bellini found himself singing Silent Night in English while Luigi harmonized in Italian, their voices blending with those of American guards in a choir that transcended linguistic differences to express universal aspirations for peace, love, and mutual understanding, hopes that could survive the war's end and influence future relations between nations. The banquet included dishes representing traditions from both countries, prepared collaboratively by cooks who had learned from one another, creating a hybrid cuisine that symbolized possibilities for cultural cooperation, capable of enriching both societies if goodwill were to replace hateful propaganda in the post-war world. Simple gifts were exchanged: handwritten letters, small handicrafts, shared family photographs, modest gestures whose emotional significance far outweighed their material value because they represented mutual recognition of a shared humanity that transcended different uniforms and opposing national loyalties. The texture of the evening, warm wine, harmonious voices, gentle lights, spontaneous embraces, created memories that each participant knew he would carry forever, as evidence that even war could produce moments of unexpected grace when hearts opened to the possibilities of love instead of hate. When the last song was sung and the final prayers whispered, the silence that followed was heavy, with a collective awareness that everyone had participated in something sacred, something that had changed their understanding of enmity, nationality, and the human potential to transcend divisions through genuine hospitality, inspired by a shared faith in the redemptive power of love. Miller watched men on both sides discreetly wipe away tears, knowing he had witnessed a small miracle of human diplomacy, one that no official treaty could have accomplished so effectively. The spring of 1944 brought news that the war in Italy was drawing to a close and that repatriation agreements were being negotiated, information that should have sparked unanimous celebration, but instead created conflicted feelings in men who had found an unexpected version of home on American soil. It forced them to confront the reality that returning to Italy would mean leaving behind relationships and experiences that had redefined their understanding of identity, loyalty, and the possibilities of human fraternity that transcended political borders. Bellini walked through the gardens the prisoners had tended over the winter, watching green shoots that symbolized renewal and growth, while reminding him that natural cycles continued regardless of human drama, a perspective that helped him process his personal transformation as part of larger historical changes, reshaping not only political maps, but individual consciences. His letters to Elena now included detailed descriptions of American farming techniques he intended to implement on his family property, practical gifts of knowledge that would turn his experience as a prisoner into valuable resources for the post-war reconstruction of his local community. He had learned enough English to hold complex conversations about philosophy, politics, and religion, with guards who had become genuine friends, relationships that defied simple captor-captive categories to create something closer to voluntary, cultural exchange among men who respected differences while celebrating shared values. His nights were filled with reading American literature, loaned by Father O'Leary, books that expanded his understanding of a country he had judged only through propaganda, discovering complexities and contradictions that made him question the simplistic ideologies he had accepted unquestioningly in his fascist youth. The texture of his transformation was so gradual he barely noticed daily changes, yet in retrospect, he recognized he had become a fundamentally different person, more questioning, more open, more aware of his own humanity and that of others, even those defined as enemies by temporary historical circumstances. Luigi faced the prospect of repatriation with particular anxiety, because his American experience had been so positive that he feared returning to the reality of a war-ravaged Italy might be more traumatic than his initial capture. A psychological inversion that surprised and confused him, since it contradicted the usual expectation of preferring freedom at home over captivity abroad. He had corresponded regularly with Tony Benedetto about future immigration possibilities, conversations that revealed dreams of bringing his family to America after the war, using the culinary skills he had learned to establish a restaurant that could serve as a cultural bridge between Italian and American communities in some Midwestern city, where hospitality and hard work would be valued regardless of national origin. His young hands had become extraordinarily skilled in culinary techniques that combined family traditions from Abruzzo with innovations learned from American cooks, creating a hybrid repertoire that represented the cultural fusion that had taken place within his own identity during months of involuntary immersion in American society. His letters home now included specific requests that his family consider post-war emigration, carefully constructed arguments that tried to communicate the opportunities he had discovered without sounding disrespectful of family traditions or disloyal to a homeland that had suffered so much under occupation and civil war. He had begun to dream of a future where he could serve as a cultural translator, helping other Italian immigrants navigate American systems while preserving cultural identities that would enrich American diversity rather than be absorbed into homogeneous conformity. His nights were devoted to intensive English study, with materials the guards had voluntarily provided, preparing for future possibilities that would require fluency capable of opening professional and social doors in a society that had shown a remarkable capacity to integrate immigrants who contributed positively to their local communities through hard work and responsible civic participation. Sergeant Miller compiled detailed reports on the successes of the humanitarian program he had overseen, documentation he hoped would influence future policies for the treatment of prisoners and perhaps even serve as a model for immigrant integration. Programs that could benefit America by attracting international talent and perspectives that would strengthen the country's cultural and economic capacities. His observations identified specific attitude and behavior changes that could be quantified and analyzed by academic researchers interested in the social psychology of conflict and reconciliation. Contributions to knowledge that transcended immediate military value to address larger questions about human nature and the possibility of overcoming prejudice through direct experience and respectful treatment. He had established correspondence with universities studying international relations, offering empirical data on the effectiveness of person-to-person cultural diplomacy that could inform future strategies for alliance building and conflict prevention. Through exchange programs promoting mutual understanding before political differences escalated into military violence, his own reflections on supervising Italian prisoners had changed his perspective on a military career, awakening an interest in diplomatic or educational work where he could apply lessons learned about the power of hospitality and mutual respect to resolve international conflicts through methods that preserved the human dignity of everyone involved. He had carefully documented statistics on reduced disciplinary problems, increased voluntary cooperation, and the development of positive relationships between guards and prisoners as evidence that investments in humane treatment produced measurable dividends, justifying added costs on both moral and practical grounds. His policy recommendations emphasized the importance of cultural training for military personnel likely to interact with foreign populations, preparation that could transform potentially hostile encounters into opportunities to build goodwill that would serve American interests in the long term by creating positive impressions that would influence opinions of the United States for generations. Father O'Leary organized farewell ceremonies that would honor both the personal transformations he had witnessed and the genuine friendships that had developed among men who had begun as enemies but were leaving as brothers in Christ. Men who had discovered a shared humanity through experiences of mutual vulnerability and unexpected grace. His final homilies emphasized the responsibilities that accompany the privilege of having experienced Christian love in action, calling both prisoners and guards to be ambassadors of reconciliation in their future communities, spreading messages of hope and possibility that could influence attitudes about forgiveness, hospitality, and the human potential to transcend divisions through faith enacted in practice. He prepared personalized certificates for each prisoner, documenting not only their time in the camp, but specific contributions they had made to community building, testimony to the possibilities of peaceful cooperation between different cultures that respected fundamental human dignity, regardless of temporary national or political affiliations. His prayers included specific petitions that relationships formed in captivity might continue through correspondence, maintaining emotional connections and potentially facilitating future opportunities for visits or immigration that would allow the preservation of friendships that had transcended wartime circumstances to touch something eternal about humanity's capacity for love that survives temporary conflicts. He established a special fund to help prisoners who wished to return to America after the war, voluntary contributions from guards and their families who wanted to offer tangible support for dreams born of shared experiences that had changed everyone's perspectives on the possibilities of international brotherhood, grounded in shared Christian values. His own reflections on the theological meaning of the experience led him to question traditional distinctions between us and them, which seemed less relevant in the face of empirical evidence that divine love works through human hospitality that recognizes no artificial borders created by politics and history, suggesting that the kingdom of God might be manifested through simple acts of kindness that turn enemies into friends through the practical demonstration of gospel values. The last days were marked by intense exchanges of addresses, promises of future correspondence, and simple yet meaningful gifts that symbolized relationships that had transcended wartime context to create lasting connections based on mutual respect and shared experiences none of the participants would ever fully forget. Bellini carefully packed books he had been lent, and that were now his to keep. Farewell gifts that represented the American investment in his continuing education and the hope that the knowledge he had gained would be used to build future bridges between cultures that had found common ground through practical hospitality, demonstrating the possibilities of peaceful cooperation. Luigi carried handwritten recipes and promises of future help with immigration, tangible hopes he could share with his family as evidence that America offered real opportunities to people willing to work hard and contribute positively to societies that valued cultural diversity as a strength rather than a threat. The final farewells were marked by embraces that conveyed emotions words could not adequately express, a silent recognition that all had participated in something extraordinary that changed their understanding of war, peace, enmity, friendship, and the human potential to transcend divisions through simple acts of kindness that spoke more eloquently of civilizational values than any official propaganda could achieve. When the last train pulled away, carrying repatriated prisoners back to a war-ravaged Italy, those who remained, guards, staff, chaplain, knew they had witnessed and taken part in a small miracle of human diplomacy that proved it was possible to turn enemies into friends through treatment that honored the fundamental dignity shared by all human beings, regardless of the temporary historical circumstances that had placed them on opposite sides of political conflicts. The texture of the farewell, genuine tears, sincere promises, brotherly embraces, created memories each participant would carry as evidence that even war can produce moments of grace when hearts open to the possibilities of love instead of hate, leaving all transformed by the experience of discovering humanity where they least expected to find it. The echo of the train's final whistle lingered in the Kansas air, like a promise that the seeds planted during those extraordinary months would continue to grow in Italian soil carried by men, returning home not just as former prisoners, but as unwitting ambassadors of an America that had surprised everyone with its ability to win hearts through the oldest and most powerful of weapons, genuine hospitality. Years later, when historians tried to understand how post-war Italy developed such positive relations with the United States, they would find in the letters and memoirs of former prisoners an explanation that transcended official diplomatic agreements. Bellini returned to his farm in Tuscany, where he implemented American agricultural techniques that tripled his yields, and, more importantly, where he raised his son, born during his captivity, on stories of American hospitality that shaped an Italian generation more open to Atlantic cooperation. Luigi eventually emigrated to Chicago in 1947, where he opened a restaurant that became a gathering place for American veterans and Italian immigrants, a physical space that embodied the cultural fusion born in those Kansas camps. His hybrid recipes, born of the forced collaboration between Italian traditions and American resources, became culinary symbols of an international friendship tempered in the most unlikely of kitchens. Sergeant Miller rose to diplomatic roles where he applied lessons learned about the power of practical hospitality, influencing American policies toward refugees and immigrants for decades to come. Father O'Leary continued his bridge-building mission, establishing exchange programs that kept alive the friendships born behind barbed wire. And so the story of the Italian prisoners of war who couldn't believe they were being served pasta and wine in American camps became more than a curious anecdote of World War II. It became enduring, evidence that true victory in any conflict does not lie in the enemy's destruction, but in the transformation of adversaries into friends through the practical demonstration that, beneath different uniforms and opposing flags, we share the same fundamental humanity, one that answers kindness with gratitude, respect with loyalty, and hospitality with lasting love. The war had ended, but its most precious lesson was only beginning. That hearts won by kindness stay won forever, and that a simple dinner shared with dignity can change the course of history more effectively than 1,000 battles won by force.